Yeah, this tracker is really the first of a kind to provide a comprehensive overview of climate change progress across 9,000 listed company globally. So this tracker, in a sense, highlight that, despite, all the talk about climate by corporates, overall, the level of emission of listed companies globally is still at the same level as 2013. So we're now faced with no less than 6 years left, before actually breaching the 1.5 budget. So the aim of the tracker is really to provide that transparency on progress, to be able to highlight, which company has done a lot, in terms of reduction, which ones are lagging, so that there is, full transparency on progress, which we think is much needed. Yeah, so 2050 may sound like, very far away in the future, or almost 30 years away. But, companies that need to change their business model needs to start doing it now. Long-term investors need also to start, changing the structure of their portfolio. So these changes in business strategies, this reallocation of capital and the repricing of assets will not happen in 10 or 20 years. It's actually taking place, right now. So over 90% of all public companies in the world are not on track to reduce emission for keeping global warming to 1.5 degrees. So if we were to limit warming to 1.5 degree, then every public company would need on average to reduce its total carbon emission or intensity by at least 10% each year until 2050. So that's a huge change, if you want, that is needed. And so investors can play a significant role in funding this transition. It's really moving away from funding, for example, coal projects and reinvesting more towards companies that are providing a green solution or series of green solutions. Most of the innovation will actually come from new initiative, new businesses, and that's where again investor can play a major role. But investors have also a massive influence on the companies. They're the shareholder, so they can support management, in their journey to transform their business model, or they can put pressure on boards to change the direction if progress is too slow, or even if climate change is totally ignored for high intensive industries. So we need a dynamic, dramatic and dynamic acceleration with regards to this transition. And what we would expect is that relatively quickly all companies would need to set emission reduction targets, set them, and then communicate publicly about those targets. And those targets should cover the direct emission, but also the one linked to the supply chain, as well as the one caused by the use of their product. Otherwise, you can actually only disclose a tiny portion of the real emission linked to those targets. So this is what we would expect, and that transparency will help accelerate the transition. Well, clearly for shareholders, but also for many of the other stakeholders, such disclosure would provide critical insight on how a company may help or hurt a net zero economy. Today there is a lot of talk, a lot of qualitative comment, but really what investors need is numbers, really hard data. This data is needed to allow the investors to assess essentially the vulnerability or the resilience to climate change of every asset that they own, whether it's a company, a project, or a building, right? So they can then evaluate both risk and opportunities across their portfolio. Much of that information comes from company, but also much of it today is not disclosed, right? So that's why we think it's really important to have those disclosure across the board in order to bring an even playing field. There are lots of companies that are actually disclosing voluntarily, but a lot of them are not. So these minimum standards will bring the transparency needed for this reallocation of capital. Yeah, so at MSCI, we're really committed to provide the necessary research, tool, solution to help all market participants accelerate, this economic transition. There's a lot to be done. There's a high need for analytical tool. You need to understand, transition risk. You need to understand how your portfolio, if you're an investor, is positioned towards the green economy. You need to understand physical risk. You need to understand the alignment of each company towards a net zero or 1.5 degree goal. So a lot of analytical tools are needed. But it's not just for investors. Companies need also, when they think about their net zero strategy, to be able to measure progress. They need to be able to understand the physical risk linked to their own location, their physical their offices, physical plants, etc. So that's what we really aim to provide. We will also continue to publish, the net zero tracker on a quarterly basis. We believe transparency is really important, and so we want to make sure that this type of information is widely disseminated. We have our own net zero target, before 2040. And we will also be joining the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, in particular focusing on creating the Net Zero Financial Service Provider Alliances, which really would aim to bring together a lot of the market participant, index provider, data provider, rating agency, accounting firm, in order to provide, again, the necessary tools and framework to help investors and companies to accelerate this transition to a net zero world.